So it's
Yes,
7
yes.
p.m. So I think it's time for starting our lecture. So welcome to the lecture, which is a part of the ongoing SoLS lecture series. The SoLS lecture series invites leading global scholars from the multitude of disciplines to share their views and generate new ideas for humanities and applied social sciences. And keeping with the tradition of School of Liberal Studies at UPS, this lecture series aims to promote scholarship from a transdisciplinary perspective. So today we have Professor Dr. Akshaya Jha with us. So Dr. Akshaya Jha is an assistant professor of economics and public policy in the Carnegie Mellon University, Haynes College of Information Systems and Public Policy. Jha's research interest lies at the intersection of energy and environmental economics and industrial organization. His research uses a combination of economic modeling and causal inference techniques to quantify the economic and environmental costs and benefits of a wide range of policies impacting wholesale electricity supply. In recent work, he has examined the introduction of financial trading to California's wholesale electricity market, the phase out of nuclear power in Germany, the dramatic growth of rooftop solar capacity in Western Australia, and the determinants of electricity blackouts in India. Uh, Dr. Jha has received a BS in economics and statistics from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD in economics from Stanford University. So the floor is yours, Dr. Jha. And before you start, we would expect an intensive Q&A session. So it would be great if you can wrap up your talk in a 40 minutes so that we can have a 20 minutes of discussions. But we are of course flexible with the timings within this 1 hour span. And also I would request that since the chat function is kept disabled, so if the audience has a question, please raise your hands. And at the end of the talk, you can have an interaction with him by unmuting yourselves. Thank you. And Dr. Jha, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Let's see, right here. There we go. So I'm on my laptop, so I can see. Okay, I can see you guys as well. So this is, before I get started, I just want to note joint work with, maybe I'll go ahead and mute. No, Mike. Okay, I don't have that capability, but anyway. So as a joint work with Louis Prionis, who's at University of Maryland, and Fiona Berlig, who's at the University of Chicago. This is going to be a paper on the role of the wholesale electricity sector. So where power plants sell to distribution utilities, what is the role of that sector on the rolling outages or blackouts faced by end-use consumers, households, and firms in India? So across low and middle-income countries, blackouts are common. These rolling outages faced by end-use consumers are quite common. So this is focusing on large cities in Africa. Obviously,
oh my God. Yeah, the accent
is this is the same is true for India as well. So these blackouts impose substantial costs on firms and households. So these outages faced by end-use consumers are imposing substantial costs.
Sorry, Akshay. I will just interject. Can I request all the audience to mute your audio, please? I think it's Zainab whose audio is still on.
So, yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks. So I'll jump back in. So basically, we're still in the motivation of the paper, which is basically that these blackouts faced by end-use consumers impose substantial costs on firms and households. There's previous work on this as well, and this is just showing a Wall Street Journal article saying the same. And why did these blackouts occur? So previous work has focused, and common reasons in the previous literature is focused on failing transmission or distribution infrastructure, insufficient generating capacity. So all the power plants are operating at capacity. There still isn't enough. So there's no way in which to supply more electricity that's demanded by end-use consumers. But the one that I'm going to focus on today is that these distribution utilities choose not to satisfy all end-use demand. So meaning that utilities, based on their financial incentives, are going to choose not to purchase less from the wholesale sector when wholesale procurement costs are low, leading to less electricity supplied to end use consumers. Okay, so I'll get all that. So that's the explanation we're going to focus on. To give you a preview of the findings, just quickly, the first finding is going to be based on an instrumental variables regression, but basically the point being that as average variable costs increase, we see decreases in the equilibrium quantity supplied in the wholesale sector. So utilities are choosing to purchase less from the wholesale sector when the average variable costs of production in the wholesale sector are higher. And obviously, utilities choosing to purchase less from the wholesale sector lead to less electricity being supplied in the retail sector to end use consumers. Okay, so that's going to be the first finding. Second finding, we're going to focus on the supply side misallocation in the wholesale sector. And to do that, I'm going to have two different metrics. One is to calculate the difference in production costs under observed dispatch. So power plants operating as they actually do, what are the production costs associated with that? Versus if we were to stack up power plants from lowest cost to highest cost and the efficient dispatch, see what production costs would be for the observed level of quantity there. What is the difference in those production costs? How much lower are production costs if we were to redispatch power plants based on lowest to highest cost? And so with that kind of metric in mind, what we're going to show is that low cost plants frequently call outages for economic reasons. So in the data, it doesn't say, hey, our equipment failed, there's a transmission failure. Instead, it's going to say, for economic reasons, we're going to be unavailable to produce. So for our incentives are such that the power plant is going to shut down and not produce. And so we're going to provide evidence that these discretionary outages, these outages for economic reasons, stem from buyers and sellers being prohibited from financially trading contracted positions. So that's something I'll get into a little bit in the institutional details, but buyers and sellers of electricity, they sign these long-term contracts and they are not able to trade their contracted positions across buyers and sellers, so they're kind of locked into the contract they've signed. Okay, I'll close by talking about counterfactual analysis. So remember that the first result was that an increase in average variable costs leads to a decrease in quantity supplied. So I'm going to calculate what is the decrease in average variable costs from returning the plants on discretionary outage to service. So take those plants that are listed as being on outage, they are unavailable to produce for economic reasons, and then return those to service. And then apply, so we're going to have more plants in the dispatch curve. And we're going to say, well, okay, with that new supply curve, what is the reduction in average variable cost of production? And that decrease in average variable cost of production, how does it impact quantity supplied, right? How much more quantity is supplied to end users as a consequence of that reduction in supply side misallocation? And so we're going to find that the increase in quantity supplied from eliminating discretionary outages are sufficient to eliminate blackouts for roughly 10% of Indian households. So a fairly sizable increase in quantity. Okay. Okay. For time, I'm going to skip kind of the contributions to existing work and then jump right into the heart of the paper here. So let me go ahead and do that. The first thing I'll talk about is kind of this very simple, basic conceptual framework, which I hope illustrates what we're doing. So consider a market with 3 power plants, a low-cost power plant, a mid-cost power plant, and a high-cost power plant. And consider the case of India where demand is downward sloping. So where demand intersects the marginal cost curve is where the price, what was the market clearing price, and here's the market clearing quantity. So again, this is a very stylized model. Obviously, in India, the market doesn't work quite so simply, but this is even in a stylized setting kind of showing what the point of the paper is. So in the West, in countries such as the United States or the UK, demand is thought of as being perfectly inelastic, meaning that no matter what the cost is of procuring electricity in the wholesale sector, utilities are obligated to satisfy all electricity demand. So if you turn on a light switch, the light must go on. And so here would be kind of the representation of the demand curve that would occur in the West. And so as you can see, more quantity is supplied, but at a higher price. So that's the trade-off, right? So the trade-off is you see an increase in quantity. If you were to impose that all electricity demand must be satisfied, that utilities are not allowed to load shed, then you would see an increase in quantity supplied, but that would come at an increase in price, right? An increase in the cost of procurement. And so this is point one, is that, unlike in the West, where there's a regulatory, it's by regulatory dictate that utilities must satisfy all electricity demand. In India, there's no such regulatory compact, regulatory dictate. And so you do see that as costs increase, quantity decreases. And to show you that, consider an undistorted market. So consider India, where we have all three power plants. And suppose that plant one chooses not to produce, or suppose that plant one is unavailable to produce. In that case, we have to take it out of the supply curve. We shift supply over to the left. And we see that the quantity supplied goes down and the price, in this case, goes up, right? So meaning, if you were to have a supply side distortion in the wholesale sector in India, meaning there was some financial trading restrictions lead to some supply side distortion, as we'll show, power plants choosing not to produce for any reason, that's going to lead to an increase in average variable costs. That's going to lead to a shift in the marginal cost curve in this stylized example, and therefore less quantity supplied to end use consumers, an increase in rolling outages. Okay, so that's the point of the paper, very simple. And so now I'm going to move into kind of the institutional details. No, okay. So in India, regulated retail prices that the utilities receive, so the prices that utilities receive for selling their electricity in the retail sector to end-use consumers, are too low for utilities to recover the costs of purchasing and distributing electricity. And this is exacerbated. The revenues received by utilities are even lower because of the underpayment to power bills, as well as electricity theft. So utilities are losing money on the electricity they're supplying to some classes of end-use consumers. And in fact, the regulators each year provide a lump sum to utilities in order to make them whole again. So they're losing money as they're selling electricity because the retail prices are set too low relative to their costs of procuring electricity in the wholesale sector and distributing that electricity. But then each year they're receiving this kind of payment in order to make them whole again. And where do utilities buy wholesale electricity from? So from the wholesale sector. Well, roughly 95% come from these long-term bilateral contracts. And then the day-ahead market, there's roughly 3 to 4% of electricity is purchased from there. So let's focus on these long-term contracts. So the long-term contracts are between power plants and utilities. And these long-term contracts specify a fixed regulated rate. So you should think of cost of service regulation. So it's the regulator sets the price based on some notion of the costs faced by the power plant. So importantly, these prices do not vary with demand conditions. So if it's really hot and everybody wants to turn on their air conditioning, the wholesale price in the contract will not increase to reflect those scarcity conditions, right? So it's kind of a fixed price over the year that doesn't reflect the fact, for example, that demand might be higher on one day, so we really want the power plant to be available to operate that day. So we argue that a contracted plant, so a plant that is under contract, has no option but to shut down if their utility counterparty chooses not to purchase from them. So what does that mean? So let's say I'm a power plant contracted with utility A. So there's utility A. Utility A says, I don't want to purchase from this power plant in this hour. Well, the power plant would like to sell to another utility or would like to sell to the day-ahead market, but is unable to do so. Why is that? Well, one, contract positions are used to allocate transmission capacity. So the power plant cannot sell to the other utility without procuring the transmission in order to transport that electricity from the power plant to that other utility. And so that becomes quite tough because transmission capacity is allocated from longer term contracts to shorter term contracts. And indeed, even if you could find that transmission capacity, there is no governing authority, there's no regulatory authority that governs financial trading of electricity. So me selling electricity to another utility, not the utility I'm contracted with. And so it's actually legally prohibited, at least during our sample period, to sell electricity via these financial contracts with another utility, even if you're in a physical contract with utility A. And so you might say, well, why not sell to the day-ahead market? Well, the reason you can't sell to the day-ahead market is that the utility has the right to call upon contracted capacity up until 90 minutes before the plant would produce. So 90 minutes before delivery, the day-ahead market is already cleared, right? Like it says in the name, the day-ahead market clears 24 hours roughly before the delivery of electricity. So 90 minutes is way after the day-ahead market is already cleared. Okay, and so for that reason, a power plant has no option but to shut down. They must shut down if the utility that they're contracted with chooses not to purchase from them. Okay. So with that evidence in hand, I'm going to next talk about evidence in favor of demand being downward sloping. And let me jump right into that. So this is going to be kind of one of the quanti parts of the talk, but this is what's called an instrumental variables analysis. So roughly, so intuitively, what an instrumental variables analysis is we're saying that changes in equipment outage rate, we're assuming to be as good as random. So a power plant happens to go on equipment outage, and an outage for equipment reasons, right? Some technical failure, pipe bursts at the plant. Equipment outage leads to a plant shutting down, leading to an increase in average variable costs. And we're going to see what does that increase in average variable cost due to the quantity supplied in the wholesale sector. Okay, so that's the idea behind instrumental variables, using random variation in average variable cost generated from random variation in equipment outage rate. What happens to quantity supplied when average variable costs go up? Okay, and so I'm going to skip kind of the details. So this is the unit of observation is state S in region R and day T. We put a set of fixed effects in there as well. Standard errors are clustered by month of sample, but getting to the results, what this is saying is that as equipment outage rate increases, we see a decrease in the quantity purchased from utilities in the wholesale sector, and therefore the quantity supplied to end use consumers. So that's called a reduced form. What is the impact of equipment outage rate on the log of quantity supplied? Okay, but now getting into the IV, the instrumental variables estimate, we're going to find that a 1% increase in average variable cost of production in state S in day T leads to a 0.43% reduction in quantity supplied in the state. So as average variable costs increase, we see decreases in the amount that utilities choose to purchase from the wholesale sector, indicating that utilities are price responsive, right? Unlike in the West, where utilities are obligated to purchase the same amount of electricity no matter what the cost is, utilities in India are trading off what the costs in the wholesale sector are when deciding how much to purchase from the wholesale sector. Okay. So with that, I'm going to jump into supply side misallocation. So I've showed you evidence that utilities are price responsive. That's the demand side of the wholesale sector. Now going to the supply side of the wholesale sector. First, I want to show you this kind of aggregate what is the daily aggregate amount of power plant capacity on outage? So this is all outages, so outages of any reason. This line is equipment outage rate, so outages for technical reasons like a pipe bursting. And then this is discretionary outages, outages where the listed reason is economic in nature, meaning the power plant says, well, based on the contract that I signed, I'm unavailable to produce because either my utility counterparty didn't call upon me, or I just don't face the correct incentives to produce. So 29% of power plant capacity is under
Akshay, sorry, a clarificatory question.
Yeah, go for it.
You said that, which is true, that in the US, you're not allowed to have discretionary outages, right?
That's exactly right. Actually, let me take that back. So you're not allowed to have, utilities are not allowed to purchase less electricity if the costs are higher of procuring it. I will say you're allowed to have discretionary outages in the sense that, let's say there's a high cost power plant, a power plant that we don't want producing because it's too high cost. That plant wouldn't be producing. That's true whether or not it's in India or in the US. So let me give you an example here in the figure. So in the figure, in our data, this plant will be listed as discretionary outage. But note that even in the US context or the Western context, this power plant won't be producing because its cost is too high relative to the level of demand that's required. Does that make sense? So
yeah. Thanks. Akshay.
Yeah. So even in the Western context, we will see discretionary outages, but the main point is that this slope is vertical of demand. So the discretionary outages are because the cost is too high, not necessarily because of this demand being downward sloping. Yeah, so good question. Let me jump back in here. Yeah, so just to give you kind of a point of comparison, the total outage rate for coal-fired power plants in the US and Canada ranges from 18 to 22%. So roughly 3/4, 75% of electricity generation comes from coal in India. So that's why we focus on coal here. So 29% in India, so it's higher, but how much higher? It's not, it's up to you guys to decide whether you think that's much higher, not that much higher. But this is kind of a nice point of comparison that 18 to 22% is the total outage rate in US and Canada relative to 29% on average in India. Okay, so I apologize again for this, for another kind of quantity slide, but this is just kind of giving you one result on the supply side, which is the dependent variable is the discretionary outage rate at power plant I in state S and region R in day T. So, think about a power plant that 60% of its capacity is unavailable because of economic reasons. And so we're going to think about how do these discretionary outage rates vary across different bins of power plant characteristics and state characteristics. The first one is, are you a low marginal cost plant or a high marginal cost plant? To do that, we're going to take the plant distribution, split it right down the middle. If you're in the bottom 50%, you're a low marginal cost plant. If you're in the top 50%, you are in a high marginal cost plant. Then we're going to consider the difference in effect for power plants located in a state home to one utility versus states with multiple utilities. And so why do we think that's important? Well, we think that's important because think about a power plant located in a state with two utilities. Well, if I'm a power plant, I'm contracted with utility A. Utility A chooses not to take my electricity. They say, we don't want your electricity. Well, then the power plant cannot sell to the other utility in the state, right? That's what the financial trading restriction that's in place dictates. I cannot sell to the other utility. And so I have no option but to shut down. In contrast, in a state that has only one utility, well, presumably that if I'm a power plant
Sorry, Akshay.
Yeah.
One more.
Then
why would you call it discretionary? Because it's a forced shutdown, right?
That's right. I guess it's a forced shutdown from the perspective of a power plant in that example I gave, but discretionary from the perspective of utility. You're right. So I guess when I say discretionary, you're right to say discretionary to whom. In this case, it's utility, right? The utility says, I don't want your power, and the power plant has no option but to shut down. So it is for an economic reason, right? It's not that the power plant had a technical failure or something like that, but it's a utility. We're arguing for financial reasons, for due to their incentives, choosing to say, not take the output from the power plant, and so the power plant is forced to start shut down. So you're absolutely right. It's forced from the perspective of the power plant. It's discretionary in this example from the perspective of the utility. Does that make?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's good question in terms of discretionary, meaning discretionary to whom. So in contrast, in a single utility state, so a state that only has one utility, presumably these financial trading restrictions are less important because me as a power plant, I can't sell to another utility in the state anyway because there's only one utility, right, in that state. And so what we're going to look at is the impact of a 1 megawatt increase in forecasted demand. So the utility in each month will say, here's how much demand I'm forecasting I'll need in the next month. So that takes load shedding into account, but not short run shocks, right? So I'm forecasting a month ahead how much electricity I will need to satisfy based on the retail prices and the wholesale costs that I expect to incur. But the reason it's okay to include in the regression is because it does not include the shorter run shocks that would affect discretionary outages. Oh, it's an unusually hot day, or for some reason there's I'm trying to think of another one, but yeah, for some reason the utility wants to produce more, satisfy more electricity on that day because there's some classic consumers that really want it on that day or something like this. So that's the type of thing that won't be in forecasted demand, and therefore a short run shock that wouldn't be included in that forecasted demand. Okay. So rather than give you the regression results, I'll just give you this figure that hopefully will describe what we're finding. So what this is showing is what is the impact of a 1 megawatt increase in demand on discretionary outage rate. So those outage rates for economic reasons at high marginal cost plants versus low marginal cost plants. This is for a single discom for states that have one utility. And here you see that you don't see much of a response for high marginal cost plants, but you do see a decrease in discretionary outage rate, meaning those plants are now available to produce. So that's good among the low marginal cost plants in single discom. So meaning increase in demand leads to a decrease in discretionary outage rate for low marginal cost plants, but not high marginal cost plants. So that's exactly what we would want, right? So if I go back to this figure, we see that in response to an increase in demand, so let's say demand shifts out, we're seeing that the lower marginal cost plant comes online, but not the higher marginal cost plant. Okay, so that's kind of what we would ideally want to see, is that in response to increases in demand, the low marginal cost plants are more likely to come online. Okay. In contrast, in multi-discom states, we're seeing that both high and low marginal cost plants come off of discretionary outage. That to us is indicative of a financial trading restriction, or at least some supply side misallocation in the multi-discom states that is not present in the single discom state, right? So there's an increase in demand leading to both high marginal cost plants and low marginal cost plants coming off a discretionary outage in order to satisfy demand. To us, that kind of is evidence, at least suggestive evidence, in favor of a financial trading restriction, that a power plant or a utility has to call upon its high marginal cost plant because it cannot call upon a low marginal cost plant that is contracted with a different utility. Should I take questions now, or should I hold off until the end of the presentation? If so, I'll take Tarun. Up to you guys.
Akshay,
Go for it.
It actually relates particularly to this presentation. It's a clarificatory question.
Okay.
So
go for it.
If I can shoot that right now, I hope that's fine.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So actually, here I'm trying to understand, say, for example, there are plants operated by NTPC, right?
Yes.
Which sell electricity to more than one utility. But the utilities might not be even within the state boundary, same state boundary.
Yes.
Right. So I'm failing to square it with how does these restrictions apply? The restrictions of having multiple utilities within the same state boundaries uh, apply over here, and how are they contributing to the results that we are seeing
Mhm.
in terms of the restrictions? High marginal cost plants are coming out much more early in your results as a result of increase in forecasted demand. Can you please elaborate on that a little further?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there are power plants that sell to multiple utilities. That's one. That's let me think. That I think that's relatively rare. But what is less rare is power plants selling across state borders. That definitely happens as well. And so So that's something we're not capturing. So this is unfortunately we don't have this. We don't have data on the long-term contracts that are signed, so we can't see power plant selling this percent of their capacity to utility A, Y% of their capacity to another utility. So we don't have that data. So what we're doing is, I agree, admittedly a little crude. We're just saying, okay, given that there, majority of power plants sell within their state to a utility that's within their state, let's kind of just look at multiple utility states versus single utility states as some sort of descriptive of of this potential financial trading restriction, right? That it's more likely that a power plant in a multi-discom state will face this financial trading restriction than a power plant that's in a single utility state. But you're right to say that that's not at all a perfect measure of long-term contracting, right? Power plants do sell across state borders. You're right that some power plants do sell to multiple utilities via long-term contracts. So yeah, that's something, unfortunately, because we don't have the data, we would like to be able to just look at long-term contracting, particularly, and see what happens to discretionary outage rate when the utility counterparty doesn't want to satisfy that, doesn't want to take that output. But we have to do it kind of at the state level only because of data limitations.
Yeah, Dr. Jha, few points, just food for thought as you go forward. If you can include this point in your discussion. Till now, it is very interesting, at least in Indian context. So I am sure you are aware about the Indian situation. Day ahead market dam as well as bilateral contracts. So would you suggest?
Excuse me. Can we just hold off the questions till the end of the presentation if it's not a pressing question?
Fine, no issues.
Because that kind of breaks the flow of the presentation. Thank you.
All right. Should I move forward, or should I take Apra's question?
Yes, Akshaya, if you can wrap up. If you can wrap up in about 10 minutes, that should.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll later. Yeah.
Okay. So let me think, 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll just briefly talk about this kind of framework to investigate supply side misallocation. So what I do in this framework, and it's admittedly a crude framework as well, is to calculate each power plant's marginal cost over time. That we do based on fuel costs, on the taxes they face, other kind of data that we bring to bear on that. Then we dispatch plants from lowest cost to highest cost to satisfy the observed level of demand, calculate the short-run variable costs under least cost dispatch, and then compare what happened under least cost to what we actually observe. So again, we don't think all of that is due to supply side misallocation. We're taking transmission, we're modeling in a very crude way by, as I'll show you, other factors we're modeling in a very crude way, but at least it's kind of a metric of what supply side misallocation could be and what are the determinants of supply side misallocation. So briefly, what we find here is that, so let's focus. So this is the distribution across days of the gap between what we observe cost to be and what the cost would be under least cost dispatch, where we dispatch power plants from lowest to highest cost. This is the national version of that, where we don't say there's any transmission constraints across the whole country, probably a bit unrealistic. So we go to regional dispatch, where each transmission region is dispatched by itself. So we don't allow for interregional trade, but we also say that within region you have to satisfy all electricity demand that we observe. And then so what we do, so both of these are what quote unquote respecting all outages. So we're saying that if a plant is listed as being on outage, keep it on outage. Now, if we move to the gray curve, that is saying, forget about outages. If a plant is listed as outage, still redispatch it. Let's treat it as if it was available. And so this blue curve is saying, well, not all outages are for economic reasons. Some of them are for technical reasons. We should respect those, right? Those plants are actually not available to produce. Whereas the economic ones, they're actually available to produce, but the incentives they face lead to them being unavailable. So let's only redispatch the plants that were listed as on outage for economic reasons, in addition to the plants that are available. And so the main point of this is that outages, a sizable portion of the cost gap comes from outages. Indeed, you can see it goes from roughly, well, it says here, 12.6%, right, is the cost gap if you respect all outages, if you just keep outages in place, whereas 6.8%, it's almost 6%. It's a 6% reduction roughly if you were to redispatch all plants that were on outage. Okay, and then so now a sizable chunk of that difference comes from discretionary outages, comes from the fact that these plants are listed as being on outage for economic reasons. So let me close now with the counterfactual analysis. And so what we're going to do here is dispatch plants from lowest cost to highest marginal cost within each state under two scenarios. One is respecting all outages. So again, if a plant is listed as being on outage, we're going to take that as given and not dispatch that plant, versus eliminating discretionary outages. So if a plant is listed as being on outage for an economic reason, allow that plant to be redispatched. We're going to use our IV estimate, right? How does average variable cost impact demand? We're going to use that estimate in order to trace out that demand curve, this demand curve here. Okay. And so let me just get to the results. So I'm showing you a box plot. This is a daily total. So an observation here is a daily total amount of quantity supplied increase from eliminating discretionary outages. So let's go through what's going on here. So eliminate discretionary outages leads to decreases in the average variable cost of production. That decrease in average variable cost of production leads to utilities purchasing more from the wholesale sector. How much more? Well, on median, roughly 11 gigawatt hours per day. You can see that it can get as high as 25 gigawatt hours. And there's a tail on the right where there's certain days where there's a lot of benefit from eliminating discretionary outages. So from eliminating supply or from decreasing supply side misallocation in the wholesale sector. Okay. And so the increase in quantity supplied, as I mentioned, from eliminating discretionary outages is roughly 11 gigawatt hours per day on average, which is sufficient to eliminate rolling outages or blackouts for roughly 10% of Indian households. Okay. So roughly 10% of Indian households would now be able to have 24/7 electricity from the grid as a consequence, if we were just to do this one fix, which is eliminating discretionary outages at power plants. Okay. So to conclude, we've provided evidence that wholesale electricity demand is downward sloping in India. So utilities purchase less from the wholesale sector when wholesale procurement costs are higher. Supply side misallocation is potentially large. And a key determinant is the lack of financial trading across buyers and sellers, subject to long-term contracts at regulated prices. So reducing supply side misallocations can significantly increase quantity supplied. In terms of one potential policy implication, it would be to implement financial trading in wholesale electricity. So allow buyers and sellers to financially trade their contracted positions. But trading must be allowed after the utility decides whether to buy the plant's output. So remember, I said that the utility has up until 90 minutes until before delivery to hold on to the power plant to decide whether or not to purchase from the power plant. So recently, hour-ahead markets, so that's 60 minutes before delivery, have been implemented. And so that's actually could lead to pretty big improvements, right? Because 90 minutes before, the utility has to give up its right to the power plant's capacity. And so the power plant can sell into an hour-ahead market. And there's also been renewable trading markets that have been implemented. Again, both of these after our sample period. Unfortunately, I think as of now, not a huge amount of take up, not a huge amount of participation in these markets, but we're hoping that improves over time. And so robust financial markets can help to unlock potentially the full benefits of infrastructure investments, such as transmission upgrades. So that's kind of paper 2, which I won't present today, but our paper 2 is that we see that India has invested a lot in transmission capacity over the last 10, 15 years. To what extent do we see benefits from that transmission upgrade in terms of reductions in production costs in the observed case versus if we were to allow for financial trading if we were rather in the counterfactual? So I will stop there. Thanks so much for inviting me again, and thanks so much for your attention. Yep, I'm happy to take questions and have a discussion at this point.
Hi, Akshay. I have a few questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Actually, I'm working on this annual survey of industries data, whereby I try to evaluate the effect of open access reform on plant level electricity tariff and captive generation. I was going through your paper, and I have 2-3 questions. The first question is, it relates to the instrument variable, whereby I want to ask that is not the IEX equip outage rate, which is being used as an instrument variable in your model 2, may affect the quantity supplied, that is QT non-IEX, that is the dependent variable in model 1. It should, as a more technical outage at IEX should affect the demand from non-IEX. But if that is the case, then IEX equip outage rate should be a part of equation 1, and it does not satisfy the exclusion restriction of instrumental variable. And and the second question which I want to ask from your paper is that instead of running a regression over the average values across 96 intervals in your model 2, can't we have a regression with a full sample, that is a panel in which all 96 intervals are used? We know that one can always average the predicted value across these 96 intervals if required, but doing the regression on the original data with full panel, including 96 observations for each day, won't that be more kind of meaningful? And the last question which I want to ask you is, which relates to the long-term contract. The long-term contract also implies that, sometimes a low-cost producer is idle, which should have been the first one to operate. And also it has some kind of welfare cost. You have discussed about the counterfactuals in your paper, but if there would have been some kind of discussion on which relates to the welfare, that would have been kind of much better.
Yeah. Let me go through each of those. So I was taking notes as we were going. Okay, let me share again. There we go. So I think, so one thing is, just to be clear, I think you've read kind of an older version of the paper. Just so in this version, we've kind of ditched, I think partly for the reason you mentioned, the IEX, non-IEX, where this is just overall demand met. So both IEX and non-IEX. And then this is equipment outage rate just overall, not saying IEX equipment outage rate or only plants that are operating in the IEX. We did show in the previous version that there didn't seem to be much arbitrage between the IEX and the non-IEX. And I think that's because of this 90-minute 90-minute rule that's in there, where the utility can choose up to 90 minutes before whether or not to take the plant's output. So from a plant, only uncontracted capacity can be sold into the IEX, right? So if an IEX plant goes on equipment outage, it's right. There's no, I guess it won't shift the amount the utility chooses to purchase from its contracted plants necessarily. But anyway, I think that's kind of now not as important because we really haven't done this IEX, non-IEX distinction. So we've kind of just really focused on equipment outage rate overall, and thinking about how that impacts average variable cost and then how that impacts quantity supplied, just taking both of those and summing it, right? IEX and non-IEX. Let me jump to the next one. So yeah, going back, so again, we're not doing IEX, non-IEX. So this 96 intervals, right? So the IEX clears every 15 minutes. So there'd be 96 intervals to run the regression on if we were to focus on the IEX. Now we're doing everything just overall, not splitting into non-IEX, IEX. So that is why we can't really, and I think even in the previous version, we didn't have demand in the non-IEX for every interval, right? We just had daily demand. So we couldn't do it at a 96. We couldn't split that into 96 intervals because we didn't know how much demand there was for each of those 96 intervals. We only knew the daily total non-IEX demand. So that's why we didn't do it at the 96 interval level. Let me jump into this last one. Oh, welfare consequences. I want to talk a bit about this because we did have in a previous version of the paper, the one you saw, but also actually pretty recently as well, welfare So this we focused on eliminating discretionary outages. How does that impact quantity supplied? In a previous version, what we did was we actually went further and said, well, here's the consumer surplus. Here is the producer surplus. In this case, there isn't any producer surplus, but like, what is the producer surplus? And then, so what are the welfare consequences? The reason we decided not to go with that, at least, and you could tell us if you think that's not, if we should go back to it, is because it requires more assumptions in order to get to welfare consequences. So we are assuming that power plants operate from lowest to highest marginal cost, right? So that's something that, even within state may or may not be true. So we're making simplifying assumptions that are kind of, we argue, more okay when thinking about quantity. But if we were to try to calculate welfare, we're assuming a linear demand curve. So that's going to, this consumer surplus is going to be this triangle. Is it really linear demand? Those type of things become more important. Those assumptions become more important when calculating welfare. And so we thought it was just a little bit the assumptions were a little bit too much too much was required of us in terms of assumptions in order to calculate welfare. So that's why we kind of took it out of the most recent version of the paper.
Okay, thank you. One last thing. I mean,
yeah, go for it.
Can you give the economic kind of intuition behind this full demand mandate? I mean, I'm not able to kind of,
Yeah, sure. So in the US context or in the West context, what the regulatory compact is that utilities are obligated to purchase as much electricity as is demanded by all of its consumers in that interval. So if somebody turns on their light or turns on the light switch, the light has to go on. And so in exchange for that, the regulators are going to set a retail price that reflects the utilities costs. So in the US, for example, retail prices are much higher. And that reflects and that's because the utilities have to satisfy more electricity demand, right? It's this vertical curve here. And because, in India, as an example, retail prices are set too low, even for this level of quantity. So the kind of economic intuition is that if there's this vertical demand curve, then prices are going to be higher, retail prices are going to be higher, wholesale procurement costs are going to be higher, but in exchange, quantity is going to be 24/7, right? Households and firms get grid-based electricity anytime they demand it. And so we're not saying one is better versus the other, right? Costs are higher in the US, retail prices are higher in the US, and then there's more reliable quantity. So that's the trade-off that comes from having a full demand mandate relative to what's the context in many lower and middle income countries such as India. Make sense?
So let's move to our second question, which is from Rohit. Rohit has been raising hands from very long, and then we move to Professor SG. Okay, so Rohit?
Okay, I wouldn't mind actually going after SG, but since that's the order. Okay, so Akshay, thank you for a wonderful talk. This is, I'm not an economist or a mathematician, so this is more of a generic policy question. Um, uh, you were talking about some states, and I was particularly thinking about the state like West Bengal. And I was wondering whether your assumptions fit for a state like West Bengal, and I'll tell you why. So, for example, in a state like West Bengal, and specifically the metropolitan city of Kolkata, we have the former Kilburn and Company, the colonial company, which is now the CESC, and they have an absolute monopoly, right? So it's an absolute monopoly in terms of the fact that they rely on Coal India, which is the government, power plant, but they also have their own power plants. So they're procuring 50 to 60% of their requirement from their own power plants. They are the utility, the DISCOM, and they are now, setting up power plants abroad. So this gives them an undue advantage or leverage, if you will. And Kolkata, for a fact, if I'm not mistaken, has the highest per unit electricity, cost all over the country. And the rest of Bengal, of course, is supplied by the state of West Bengal, the government of West Bengal. So what I want to understand is what happens to these assumptions in a state like West Bengal, which does not have an open market, which has this kind of a monopoly, a centuries-old monopoly, if you will, and whether you need minor tweakings to this formulae for a state like West Bengal, or an entirely different approach. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't. So I will say that I don't think any state in India has a open market. That's tough. They have these long-term contracts, which is utility signs a long-term contract with a power plant, and then that long-term contract specifies a fixed regulated price. So that's not. I would say that's not necessarily market either. But the case of West Bengal is particularly interesting because. Like you said, it seems like there's this monopoly where the utility owns both the power plants and kind of sells demand and is in charge of distributing electricity. So at least that's supposed to be legally prohibited by the 2003 Act, which unbundles distribution of electricity from the supply of electricity. So even if in a state like most states, there'll be a generation company that's owned, like that's state owned, that owns the power plants, and then unbundled, like financially from it, is a distribution utility. So even if in name at least they're unbundled, but you're right to say that it's as good as they might be vertically integrated when it comes to how they make decisions, right? That's only on the books. Are they actually unbundled? And so I think that's going to be, in our case, I don't necessarily think a tweak in the model, but it's one way in which there could be a supply side distortion, right? Is we think about it as there being a long-term contract between the utility and the power plant. In the case of the vertical integration, it's even stronger, right? There's a reason you're going to take your own power plant's output before power plants that are owned by other companies. So there's even more reason for misallocation there, right? Maybe I have a higher cost plant, but because I own that power plant, I'm going to take that power plant's output before a lower cost plant that's owned by somebody else. So you're right to say so it's not a tweak in the regression, but it is a tweak maybe in the discussion, in the policy implication, which is to say, yes, in a lot of states, it's these financial trading restrictions. In some states, such as West Bengal, additionally, we've got to make sure the unbundling actually worked. That the generation company, the generation arm of the utility, is entirely separate in its decision-making from the distribution arm of that same utility. And so that's a great point in terms of part of the discussion maybe we should bring in, is that even that has failed in some states, perhaps, in terms of making sure that when you unbundle in 2003, the utility was actually split in its generation and its distribution. Yeah. Great question.
So much, Akshay and Rohit, for the question. Moving to SG. So,
Akshay, one quick thing, since this welfare discussion came up, there is a book that was written by V. Shantakumar, which was published by Sage.
Okay.
I forget the name of the book, but I remember it because it was done at IDF, at the organization I was in. where what he did was to calculate the welfare effects of what he called quality power, that is uninterrupted power. He surveyed all the states to see what people were doing during outages. What are the substitutes they were using? Like, and took the costs of kerosene, battery, what have you, right?
Yeah.
Did all of that. Of course, it's a very rough measure and probably an underestimate, but at least that much welfare they would have obtained, right? In terms of monetizing the welfare that they would have gained if there was no power outage. So you could take a look at that book and see, because welfare analysis, you're right, well, you have to make assumptions. You also have to assume that they're monetized, right? So it's a very complicated thing.
Yeah.
The other point I have is because, this is a policy issue, right? And why is it, if you have any, because I don't have any, even though I've looked at Indian policy for a long time, I have no rationale for why this would be done. Because I presume that as long as individuals know, households know that this power is costlier, right? They're going to use less power.
Yeah.
But and these outages are also not planned. Right? Sometimes it's a real problem and power suddenly goes off, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think was, I'm just asking you to guess here, I'm sorry, but what is the rationale for this, for the type of policy restrictions that we have? One of the things I can understand is that we may not have the technology, because to have continual pricing, you need a real machinery at work, right? You need a national grid on which all these activities are going on. But we are never going to get that expertise if we don't allow it. So my thing is that why was this in the first place thought about this way when the power sector reforms were done?
Yeah.
Do you have any explanation for that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Absolutely. So I'll actually do both questions, because I'm definitely going to look up that. So at least the term I've heard for it is value of lost load, meaning how do people value more reliable electricity? And so just to be clear on what I think wholesale welfare versus retail welfare. In the wholesale sector, the utilities are the buyers. And so that in terms of wholesale welfare, it's basically utility profits plus supplier profits. But you're right. What's more interesting, what's more important is kind of end user, right? Willingness, end user welfare.
Because for companies, we just want to make sure they're sustainable, right?
Yeah.
That they don't drop out. That's all.
That's right. And so I think they're, using backup, some companies buy backup diesel generators. Some companies choose not to buy anything, and therefore, they've kind of expressed the willingness to pay for, they don't need as reliable electricity. So I think one thing we could do, and I'm definitely going to take a look at this book, is we can at least sorry, I'm going all the way to the end. We can multiply the increase in quantity we find by some of these measures of willingness to pay.
Yeah.
And that does give a good metric of how, in terms of rupees, what the benefit might be. So I think we can do that at least. I think probably more speculative would be to do something like, what is the change in utilities profits from implementing this program? What is the change in producer surplus in terms of supplier profits? But I think in terms of willingness to pay, we can definitely provide, we can use existing estimates and just say, here's what the benefit would be to end use consumers. So I like that. Sorry. The other one is, what is the rationale for these how did this come about? Why is there this system where there's rolling outages that firms face, households face? When you said technology, where I thought you were going to go is smart metering, meaning we don't know how much each household consumes in each hour. We don't know how much each firm consumes in each hour. So utilities have to take a guess. And so because they have to take a guess when they put rolling blackouts, even forecasted ones, there's these unexpected outages, but also the ones that are scheduled, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., you will not have electricity. They have to do it at the neighborhood level, right? They can't do it. They can't target individual households and say, this household has a high willingness to pay. This firm has a high willingness to pay for electricity reliability. So we're gonna make sure they get electricity, whereas a low willingness to pay people won't get it. they have to do it at kind of a broad neighborhood level because of the technology. That in terms of the metering, they can only see each month how much each household consumed, and hourly they can only see how much like a big neighborhood is consumed.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of, yeah, sorry, go for it. Yeah.
No, I'm saying that about 2 years ago, we were in talks with a distribution company, precisely trying to do this, right? That and actually a power generator was willing to fund us. We were telling the the discoms that you buy the power at the higher cost, we'll subsidize that additional cost. But let us see how much people are willing to pay or how much do they use. So since smart meters were being put in, then let us calculate that. And they're willing to share the data with us and all of that. As you know, the data is a big problem in India. But they were willing to do all of that. But then suddenly the power generator, who was doing this as a CSR activity to support research, gave it up. But now that you are working on this, I'll try and rekindle that interest and see if they're available, because that would be really useful. Yeah, because the demand curve that you're using is hypothetical, and since we have never had a free market, we really don't know what the demand curve is like, right? It's always an approximation. But here we can actually get the demand curve if they allow us to look at the smart meter readings.
That's right. And yet another reason why we haven't gone to the welfare analysis is precisely what you said. It's our demand is kind of this hypothetical based on our estimate in the wholesale sector. We have no sense of the retail demand curve that households and firms.
That's right.
Yeah. And I mean, so that's another reason why we didn't go to welfare, is because we thought that assumption would be too much. But it would be great if you had study came through, if you were able to actually get more demand onto the, more supply onto the grid and see how much people actually are willing to pay for it. Let me know. Keep me in the loop on if that comes through, because that would definitely be useful. So right now we're kind of, like you said, hypothetical demand, because we don't have good estimates of what the retail willingness to pay would be. So definitely let us know.
Okay. So we are running out of time, and unfortunately there is only room for one question. So Dr. Roy, can you just go for your question, please?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jha, for a very lucid explanation of the entire power pricing and all the issues. Now, my question is, for quite some time in India, regulators are planning for a model that is one commodity, one market, one nation model. So one price model. And hence, what we are planning to move towards n number of buyers and number of sellers. So we have demand and supply taking the market, and we are actually moving towards a fully competitive model, wherein fully competitive pricing model, wherein demand and supply will decide everything, and hence price and quantity solutions will be much better, even from a welfarish point of view. So would you suggest to do away with these bilateral contracts and move towards exchange, power exchange system, wherein demand and supply take up these things? What is your view?
I would be yes, short answer, that's all great. I'm moving to a power exchange model. But in terms of getting rid of the long-term bilateral contracts, even in the US, in Europe, there are these long-term bilateral contracts. The key point is, one, the prices are not regulated, right? It's not a regulator setting the price. It's by negotiation between the supplier and the buyer. And two, there's financial, not physical, meaning transmission is allocated not on the basis of contracts, but it's based on the power pool. So it's so you could trade positions in day-ahead markets and real-time markets in the US and in Europe, whereas in India right now these contracts are physical. So that's kind of the big issue. I don't mind having bilateral contracts. What I mind is having it be physical, and so you're not able to financially trade across buyers and sellers, and having a regulated price in those contracts. That's set rather than having the buyers and sellers negotiate. And so I think moving to a power pool model and making sure that those contracts are financial in nature and don't have regulated prices, I think speculating would bring huge welfare benefits. So I'd definitely be in favor of that.
Can I quickly come in because my question relates very much to what Mr. Roy said. So, Akshay, you must be already aware that in India, we are toying a lot around with the idea of market-based economic dispatch. Right? And CERC and POSOCO both have a paper on it, which estimates the financial benefits that at a country level we might have once we move to an embed-based system. Although the benefits are in thousands of crores, but the reason why probably it hasn't happened till now is that the transaction costs and the litigations that might follow from moving from a bilateral contract to a market-based system is way too much, more than the benefits impact itself. So do you think that might be a reason why, despite the benefits that you have shown in your paper, it might be a long way to go to moving to more wholesale-based markets?
Yeah, so I've read that white paper. I really like it. I want to advocate for people reading that if they're interested as well. And I would say that this is true also of deregulation across the world. So if you think about historically in countries in like the U.S., electricity was provided by these cost of service regulated utilities that are vertically integrated. They own the generation, they own the transmission, they own the distribution. And then there was a shift towards markets. And so in that shift towards markets, there's something called stranded assets, right? Like, for example, power plants that were built under the expectation that there'd be regulation, not markets. Utilities making decisions under the expectation that there would be regulation, not markets. And so in any sort of kind of shift, and this is probably more of the political economy or political science that that you guys are more of an expert in than I am, but I would say that there are winners and losers, and so making sure to compensate the people who will lose out is important. I haven't seen this part where you say the benefits are lower than the costs. I would say probably the benefits in the long run will be higher, and so there has to be a compensation to these for example, power plants that have signed really lucrative long-term bilateral contracts and therefore don't want to give up that system, and they did sign those contracts and build a power plant under the expectation of regulated prices. So there is, in any sort of shift towards markets away from regulation, these stranded assets and the political economy of how do you compensate the people who would lose from a shift away is an interesting question. And I think, it's one that there's been work on more I've seen some work on it, but not as much work as kind of the economics on the benefits. So I think that's it's an interesting question. I don't have much more to say on it other than, they definitely have to compensate the losers when there's this shift to markets.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
That's it. And we are already past the stipulated time. So I would like to thank Dr. Jha for this wonderful and interesting discussion on the electricity market in India. And thank you everybody for participating in this interesting talk. And so I'd like to close the lecture for today. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Good night, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.